Welcome to the channel. Today we've got something incredible for you. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The sun had just begun to set over St. Elmsford, and the Harmonious Garden shimmered with golden light. But beneath the roses and lilies, shadows whispered secrets no one dared speak aloud. Tonight, one man would lie still among the flowers, and a puzzle of nature's darkest mysteries would unfold. Can you unravel it before the garden itself reveals the truth? Chapter 1. The Quiet Invitation. The afternoon sun lay gently across the village of St. Elmsford, painting the roofs in golden light and making the garden hedges glow with a soft, drowsy charm. Life here was always unhurried, always steady, until, one morning, a curious letter arrived in the post for certain chosen villagers. The letter, embossed with a crest of ivy and roses, was written in the fine, elegant hand of Sir Henry Blackwell, the retired botanist whose estate lay just beyond the oak-lined lane. Inside, the words read, "You are cordially invited to spend an evening in my harmonious garden, a place of beauty and puzzle alike. Nature hides her secrets, and I wish to see who among you has the patience to discover them. Dinner will follow in the conservatory." Among the recipients of this mysterious invitation was none other than Miss Jane Marple. She sat by her lace-curtained window, spectacles perched delicately upon her nose, reading the letter with a thoughtful little smile. To most, it was merely an eccentric gesture of an aging scholar. But Miss Marple, with her keen instincts sharpened by a lifetime of observing human nature, sensed something more, a reason hidden between the lines. That evening, the lane toward Blackwell Manor grew alive with quiet footsteps and hushed conversations. Guests walked beneath the arch of trees, Lady Beatrice, dressed in lavender silk with a sharp glint in her eyes, Colonel Fenton, upright and brisk, his polished cane tapping the gravel, Mr. Arthur Wells, the young scholar whose nervous glances darted from shadow to shadow, and Clara, Sir Henry's ward, whose youth and innocence seemed slightly shadowed by unease. When they reached the garden gates, they were greeted by an enchanting sight. Lanterns hung from branches, casting a warm glow upon the pathways. The harmonious garden stretched before them, a place where roses grew alongside rare orchids, and winding paths led toward a central sundial carved with strange floral markings. The air was fragrant, yet thick, almost as though the flowers themselves were whispering secrets. Miss Marple paused, her sharp eyes resting on the sundial. Something in the way its shadow stretched across the engraved symbols gave her a curious shiver. Most saw only a decorative ornament. She saw a puzzle waiting quietly, like a lock in search of its key. And as the guests entered, laughter mingling with the scent of blossoms, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered. Why would Sir Henry, a man of science and reason, invite them not merely to admire his garden, but to solve it? The evening had only just begun, and already the garden felt less like a place of harmony, and more like the opening move of a riddle cloaked in beauty. Chapter 2. A Gathering Among Blooms. The great iron gates of the harmonious garden closed softly behind the guests, and a hush seemed to fall upon them, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the faint chirp of nightingales. Lanterns lined the pathways, casting golden circles of light upon the gravel, and every flower bed shimmered as if touched by some secret starlight. Sir Henry Blackwell appeared at last, tall and distinguished despite his years. His white hair caught the glow of the lanterns, and his deep-set eyes carried the gleam of a man who had lived long with knowledge, and perhaps with secrets. He welcomed his guests warmly, his voice carrying the calm assurance of a host at home in his kingdom of blooms. "Welcome, my friends," he said, spreading his arms to the blossoming scene. "Tonight, the garden is yours. Explore it, feel it, listen to it, for every petal and every path carries meaning, though not all meanings are easily seen. The guests murmured polite thanks, yet beneath their words lay something sharper: curiosity, unease, even rivalry. Lady Beatrice stepped briskly ahead, lifting her chin. "What a display," she remarked, her tone sweet, though her eyes darted quickly about, measuring the wealth, the rarity of each plant. Colonel Fenton followed in soldierly fashion, hands clasped behind his back, as if inspecting troops rather than roses. He muttered something about precision in placement, the order of things appealing to his military eye. Mr. Arthur Wells, however, moved with a restless air, his gaze flickering between the greenhouse windows and the sundial at the centre. His fingers twitched as though itching to make notes, to possess knowledge that was not his. And young Clara, pale in her simple dress, lingered close to Miss Marple. She said little, but her eyes held shadows, as though she wished to speak but feared the weight of her words. Miss Marple, ever unassuming, walked slowly along the path, her gaze lingering on the smallest of details: the faint scuff of hurried footsteps in the gravel, the way one lantern swung more wildly than the others, as though brushed by an unsteady hand, and the subtle hush that fell whenever Sir Henry's eyes passed over his guests. The party gathered at the great sundial, its carvings clearer now in the lantern light. Strange floral symbols wound around its base: orchid, rose, lily, and others more exotic. The sundial's shadow stretched long and dark across one symbol, though none but Miss Marple seemed to take notice. Sir Henry smiled enigmatically. "You see before you not only beauty but puzzle. A garden is like life, layers of harmony, and beneath them, riddles. Some riddles may be solved, others perhaps are better left hidden." The words, though calmly spoken, seemed to settle uneasily in the night air. A faint breeze stirred the flowers, and for a moment the lantern flames trembled as though warning of what was to come. Miss Marple folded her hands lightly over her knitting bag, her eyes calm but alert. To her, this was no mere evening of polite diversion. Something about this gathering, about this sundial with its strange symbols, whispered of secrets ready to break through the still surface of the Harmonious Garden. And as the night deepened, so too did the quiet tension between blossoms and shadows. Chapter 3. The Puzzle of the Sundial. The garden had grown quieter as the lanterns flickered gently in the rising dusk. A soft mist had begun to settle along the winding paths, giving the Harmonious Garden the air of something half-dreamed, half-remembered. And at its very heart stood the sundial, cold, immovable, and strangely compelling. Sir Henry motioned for his guests to gather around it. The polished stone gleamed faintly, its carved symbols, delicate orchids, roses, lilies, and stranger flowers, not native to English soil, catching the glow of the lantern light. The shadow of the sundial's gnomon stretched long and thin, settling across one particular symbol that looked to Clara almost like a thorned bloom. She shivered, clutching her shawl tighter. "I do not like it," she whispered softly, her voice so low it was nearly carried away by the breeze. Miss Marple, ever alert to the subtleties of human nature, turned her head gently toward the girl. Clara's pale face told of unease deeper than mere superstition. Sir Henry's voice, calm yet deliberate, rose above the rustle of leaves. "This sundial, ladies and gentlemen, is more than a keeper of hours. It is a map, a guide, a riddle of nature's secrets. Each symbol you see carved upon its stone corresponds to a part of this garden, some holding beauty, others danger. For nature is generous, yes, but she is not without her poisons." His words stirred a faint ripple among the group. Lady Beatrice raised an arched brow, her tone clipped. "A clever jest, Sir Henry." Surely you do not mean us to believe this sundial carries any true power? But Colonel Fenton frowned, staring intently at the carvings as if they were military codes to be broken. Arthur Wells leaned forward eagerly, his fingers twitching near the stone as though he wished to trace the engravings, to claim them, to unlock their meaning before anyone else could. Miss Marple alone remained still, her blue eyes quietly following the shadow. She saw how the guests reacted, not to the sundial itself, but to the notion of secrets hidden within it. To the observant mind, it was not stone or shadow that mattered, but the telling flicker of pride in Wells's eyes, the forced lightness in Lady Beatrice's laughter, and Clara's frightened silence. Sir Henry's lips curved into a faint smile, but it was not a smile of warmth. Solve the sundial's riddle, and you will discover the garden's hidden truth. But beware, the garden reveals itself only to those who look closely. Shadows can guide you, or deceive you. The last words lingered in the air like the toll of a bell. For a brief moment the guests stood in thoughtful silence, the garden around them hushed as though listening too. A moth brushed past a lantern flame, its wings crackling softly, and Clara let out a nervous sigh. Miss Marple, gently folding her hands together, felt the first stirrings of unease deepen. She had spent a lifetime watching how small, ordinary things revealed great truths. A dropped stitch, a forgotten word, a glance too quickly hidden. And now she could not help but feel that this sundial, this riddle in stone and shadow, was the key not only to a puzzle of nature, but to something far darker that would soon touch them all. Chapter 4. A shadow in the twilight. The evening air grew cooler, and the Harmonious Garden seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Lanterns swayed in the faint wind, casting wavering light upon the pathways. The guests had begun to drift apart after Sir Henry's words, some wandering down the flower-lined avenues, others lingering by the fountain whose water caught the moonlight like a scatter of silver coins. Miss Marple, with her quiet step and calm manner, chose to sit for a moment on a stone bench near the rose arch. She set her knitting bag beside her, though she did not knit. Instead, she watched. She watched how Lady Beatrice walked briskly with an air of superiority, pausing often to glance toward the manor house windows. She noticed how Colonel Fenton marched along the path as if reviewing soldiers on parade, his boots crunching against the gravel. And she especially watched young Mr. Wells, who, under the cover of polite admiration, darted furtive glances toward the glass house at the far edge of the garden. Dinner was announced with the soft chime of a bell echoing from the conservatory. The guests began to return slowly, their voices carrying light laughter to mask the growing strangeness of the night. Yet, as they took their places at the long table, it was immediately clear. Sir Henry was not among them. At first the absence was passed over with polite remarks. No doubt he lingers to tend some rare bloom, Lady Beatrice suggested airily. Colonel Fenton muttered something about absent hosts and the decline of proper discipline, but Miss Marple, spoon poised over her soup, noticed the slight trembling of Clara's hand as she set her napkin down. The girl's pale eyes flicked toward the darkened garden beyond the glass. Moments later, a servant hurried in, whispering something to the butler, whose face drained of colour. A ripple of unease ran along the table. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as the guests rose. Without words, they followed the butler out into the mist-veiled night. The search was brief but tense, lanterns bobbing along the paths like wandering stars. It was Clara who first gave a cry, her voice sharp in the stillness. They rushed to the sundial, and there, sprawled across its base, lay Sir Henry Blackwell. His hand clutched a rare orchid, its petals strange and glistening in the dim light. His face, serene yet unnaturally still, seemed almost as though he had chosen this spot for his final rest. The guests gasped, Lady Beatrice pressing a hand to her throat, Colonel Fenton stiffening into grim silence. Mr. Wells hung back, eyes wide, words tumbling but never forming. Clara dropped to her knees beside her guardian, her sobs breaking the garden's eerie hush. Miss Marple alone remained composed, her keen eyes scanning not only Sir Henry's body, but the scene around it. The way the orchid's petals bore a powdery sheen, the faint disturbance of gravel near the sundial, and the peculiar angle of the fallen lantern nearby. She said nothing, but inside, a certainty formed. This was no natural collapse. The Harmonious Garden, once a place of beauty and harmony, now stood cloaked in unease. Its flowers seemed to lean closer, as though eager witnesses to a secret too grave to remain hidden. And in that quiet moment, Miss Marple knew. The riddle Sir Henry had spoken of was not merely a puzzle of flowers and shadows. It was a puzzle of life and death. Chapter 5. Clues among the flowers. The night had grown heavy, as though the garden itself mourned. A silence fell across the guests gathered around the sundial, broken only by Clara's soft weeping and the restless rustle of leaves. The lantern flames trembled in the breeze, and their flickering light revealed Sir Henry's still figure, the pale orchid caught delicately between his fingers. Inspector Graves, summoned quickly from the nearby village, arrived with a brisk step and a tone of authority. Yet for all his official air, it was Miss Marple, standing quietly with her hands folded, who truly seemed to command the moment. For while others saw only the tragedy of a sudden death, her calm eyes saw fragments of a story that had yet to be told. She moved closer to the sundial, kneeling just enough to observe without disturbing the scene. The orchid was a rare species, its petals wide and strangely luminous, dusted with what appeared to be a fine powder. Miss Marple did not touch it, but she leaned slightly, noticing how the powder clung unnaturally, as though placed there rather than grown upon it. Nearby, the gravel showed signs of disturbance. The faint impression of a boot heel was visible near the sundial's base, sharper than Sir Henry's own polished shoes would have left. Miss Marple let her eyes rest on it only a moment, then looked away, for she knew the truth of observation lay in subtlety. One must never seem to search too eagerly. She turned her gaze toward the greenhouse, its panes glinting faintly under the lantern glow. A window had been left slightly ajar, and within, rows of exotic plants stretched upward like silent sentinels. Shelves were lined with jars of pollen, neatly labelled, but she could see even from a distance that one of the jars lay empty, and another had toppled, a crack glinting across its glass. Poison, she thought silently, though she did not speak the word aloud. For in her long years in St. Mary Mead, she had learned that murder often wore the face of delicacy. A teacup, a slice of cake, a single flower. It was not brute force, but cunning, that most often revealed the darker corners of human nature. The others stood close, uneasy in their silence. Lady Beatrice muttered about wills and inheritances, her eyes carefully avoiding Clara's tear-stained face. Colonel Fenton stood stiff, arms crossed, as though this were a battlefield casualty rather than a death among friends. Mr. Wells lingered at the edge, his nervous eyes darting constantly toward the greenhouse, his lips pressed tight as though holding back words. Miss Marple, however, only tilted her head, the faintest of smiles touching her lips, though her eyes remained serious. She had seen enough to know that Sir Henry's death was not the hand of fate. It was the hand of ambition, pride, and perhaps desperation, hidden beneath the beauty of a flower. The Harmonious Garden, so carefully arranged, had yielded its first clue, and Miss Marple, in her gentle way, had begun to piece together the riddle, not of sundial and shadow, but of hearts and hands, that sought to bend nature to their will. The night deepened, the fragrance of blossoms lingering heavy in the air, and Miss Marple thought quietly to herself, "In every garden there are weeds, and in every gathering, secrets waiting to be unearthed." Chapter 6. The Secrets of the Guests. The conservatory's tall windows glimmered faintly under the lantern light, their panes reflecting the pale faces of the guests as they returned inside. Though the butler had laid out supper once more, no one lifted a spoon. The air, once filled with polite chatter and the fragrance of flowers, now felt close and heavy, thick with unspoken questions. Inspector Graves had taken a seat at the far end of the table, notebook in hand, his voice brisk and direct as he asked each guest to account for their movements. Yet it was not his questions that held the true weight. It was the answers, the silences between them, and the furtive glances that betrayed more than words ever could. Lady Beatrice spoke first, her chin lifted high, her tone carrying the faintest edge of irritation. "I had no reason to harm Sir Henry. We disagreed, yes, on the matter of his estate. He believed too much should go to that girl." She gestured faintly toward Clara, whose tearful eyes widened. "But to quarrel is not to kill. You mustn't confuse plain speaking with malice." Miss Marple, quietly knitting now in her lap, noted how Lady Beatrice's hands trembled despite her sharp words, her rings clinking faintly against the glass she lifted but did not drink from. Her pride was her shield, but shields often concealed wounds. Colonel Fenton leaned back in his chair, his posture rigid, his voice clipped like the bark of a drill sergeant. "I was walking the paths, admiring the orderliness of the flower beds. I heard no cry, no sound of distress. Sir Henry was a good man, though he meddled where he needn't, financial matters mostly." His jaw tightened, and he glanced away quickly, as though ashamed of something half buried. Mr. Wells fidgeted constantly, his spectacles sliding down his nose, his hands twitching as if they longed for pen and paper. I merely looked at the glass house," he stammered. "Sir Henry's work is renowned, and I hoped to glimpse his specimens. Nothing more. I respected him deeply." His words tumbled too quickly, betraying nerves that no honest admiration could explain away. Clara, poor child, remained silent until prompted. Her voice, soft as falling rain, trembled as she spoke. "Uncle Henry. He was kind, always. But he warned me never to touch certain flowers, never to wander near the sundial when shadows lengthened. I feared the garden sometimes." Her eyes darted around the table, settling at last on Miss Marple, as though seeking comfort in her calm presence. Through it all, Miss Marple listened. Her needles clicked softly, a gentle rhythm against the tension in the room. To others it might have seemed she was lost in her knitting, but in truth, her eyes saw everything. The pride in Lady Beatrice's lifted chin, the guilt pressed into Colonel Fenton's clenched jaw, the ambition smouldering in Mr. Wells's restless hands, and the fear trembling in Clara's voice. She had learned long ago that human nature is much like a garden. Some flowers bloom in sunlight, others thrive in shadow, and some conceal thorns beneath their beauty. This gathering was no different. Each guest carried secrets, carefully tended like hidden seeds. And Sir Henry's death had been the rainstorm that loosened the soil, allowing those seeds to push through the surface. The garden outside lay quiet, but inside, the true harmonious garden of greed, pride, envy, and fear had begun to reveal itself. Miss Marple lowered her eyes, a faint smile touching her lips. She was not deceived by their words. The truth was here, among them, waiting patiently for someone to see. Chapter 7. The Riddle of the Garden Map. The storm of questions in the conservatory slowly ebbed into uneasy silence. Inspector Graves scribbled in his notebook, but his stern lines of inquiry brought no clear answers. The guests, restless and pale, drifted into quiet corners, their thoughts too heavy for further conversation. Miss Marple, however, moved with her usual gentle calm. She excused herself softly, her knitting bag in hand, and wandered through the shadowed hallways of Blackwell Manor. Her steps carried her not by chance but by instinct, a lifetime's habit of knowing when a room might hold more truth than a conversation ever could. At last, she came to Sir Henry's private study. The door stood slightly ajar, as though left in haste. She slipped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim glow of a single lamp left burning. The room smelled faintly of dried herbs and pressed flowers, mingled with the sharper tang of ink and parchment. The walls were lined with shelves of botanical journals, some in Latin, others in Sir Henry's own careful hand. Yet it was the great oak desk at the centre that drew Miss Marple's quiet attention. Papers lay scattered, but atop them, carefully pinned beneath a paperweight, was a large hand-drawn map. She leaned closer. The map was no ordinary sketch. It was a chart of the Harmonious Garden itself, drawn with meticulous precision. Every path, every arch, every flower bed was marked, and around the edges were the same floral symbols carved into the sundial outside. Orchids, lilies, roses, and more exotic blooms stretched across the parchment in delicate ink. But there was more. Some sections were lightly shaded, notes scribbled in Sir Henry's tidy script. Healing, rare fragrance, growth in shade. Others bore darker marks, the words sharper, almost warning. Toxic, hallucinogenic, fatal in concentrated form. And then Miss Marple saw it. A faint cross inked beside one quadrant of the garden, corresponding to a symbol she recalled from the sundial. The flower it marked was stramonium, known by another name in village whispers, devil's trumpet. A plant of haunting beauty, yet deadly, its poison hidden within trumpet-shaped blossoms. Miss Marple's brow furrowed ever so slightly. The sundial, then, was no mere ornament. It was a cipher, pointing shadows towards sections of the garden, each with their own properties, some life-giving, some lethal. Sir Henry had built not just a garden, but a puzzle of nature's power, a living map that only the observant could read. She let her eyes travel once more across the map, noting how carefully it had been designed, how knowledge and secrecy intertwined in every line. It was not the work of a man seeking mere beauty. It was the work of one guarding truths both wondrous and dangerous. And now he lay dead, a rare orchid in his hand, its petals dusted with poison. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her expression calm yet thoughtful. She had seen such things before. The pride of those who hoarded knowledge, the envy of those who wished to claim it, the desperation of those who feared being left behind. The garden whispered its secrets on parchment and stone, in shadow and in bloom. And she knew with a quiet certainty that Sir Henry's map was not simply a guide to plants, but a guide to motives, and perhaps even to murder. She folded her hands gently over her knitting bag, her eyes lingering once more on the faint cross marked in ink. The garden itself holds the answer, she thought, and the sundial will show who knew its secrets best. Chapter 8. A Gentle Trap. The dawn of the following day came softly, with mist curling low across the Harmonious Garden. Dew clung to every petal, turning roses and lilies into jewelled ornaments glistening under the pale light. The air was calm. Too calm, thought Miss Marple, for a house that now held both grief and suspicion. The guests gathered again at Sir Henry's request table in the conservatory, though without Sir Henry's reassuring presence, their words felt brittle, strained. Inspector Graves pressed them once more, but the tension only grew thicker, each denial adding weight to the atmosphere. Lady Beatrice snapped impatiently, Colonel Fenton grew stiff with irritation. Mr. Wells trembled beneath the inspector's questions, and Clara sat silent, her hands folded like a penitent child. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting bag, let the moment stretch until all were weary of Inspector Graves's stern voice. Then, with her characteristic gentleness, she spoke. "Perhaps," she said, "the garden itself may help us." Sir Henry seemed to believe it held answers, and I dare say it still might. Her soft words, so calmly spoken, brought every head around to her. With a serene nod, she suggested they all walk to the sundial once more. The group followed, lanterns in hand, though the morning light had begun to burn through the mist. The sundial stood as it had before, its carvings faintly damp with dew, its shadow stretching like a dark finger across the engraved symbols. Miss Marple, her face calm and unreadable, asked each guest in turn to align the sundial's shadow and explain what they understood of its markings. Lady Beatrice scoffed lightly, brushing her hand along the stone but offering no insight beyond a sharp remark about old men's puzzles. Colonel Fenton examined the carvings with a soldier's seriousness, muttering about discipline and codes, but his interpretation was mechanical, without depth. Clara, nervous and hesitant, only whispered that the sundial frightened her, and she would rather not touch it at all. Then it was Mr. Wells's turn. His hand lingered too long upon the symbols, his eyes flicking nervously to Miss Marple's calm face. When he shifted the shadow to fall upon the quadrant marked with the faint cross, stramonium, devil's trumpet, his lips parted as though he had revealed too much by instinct. Miss Marple's voice, gentle yet unyielding, broke the silence. "You know precisely what this means, don't you, Mr. Wells? You knew where the sundial would point and what flower lay in that quadrant. It was not by chance that Sir Henry held an orchid dusted with poison. It was placed so by one who believed knowledge could be claimed by cunning rather than earned by patience." Mr. Wells paled, his voice faltering. I don't know what you mean." But Miss Marple did not raise her tone. She merely continued with the calm authority of truth. "Your fingers, Mr. Wells, stained faintly with pollen, your eyes always straying to the glass house, and now your eagerness to align the sundial with the very quadrant Sir Henry marked as dangerous. Pride, envy, desperation, they speak louder than words." The garden itself seemed to hold its breath. The lanterns swayed in the morning breeze, petals shivered, and the guests stood transfixed as Mr. Wells's composure broke. His trembling hand fell from the sundial, and his voice collapsed into bitter confession. "Yes," he cried, though his tone was more despair than triumph. "He dismissed me, called my research shallow. I wanted his secrets, his discoveries, the recognition that should have been mine. I thought no one would notice a flower, a simple orchid touched with powder. But he did not fall as I expected. He clutched it, as though mocking me even in death." Clara gave a startled sob, and Lady Beatrice gasped. Colonel Fenton muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. But Miss Marple simply folded her hands together and looked upon Mr. Wells with a mixture of pity and quiet certainty. "Ambition," she said softly, "is like a weed. Left untended, it chokes all that is good around it. Sir Henry tended his garden with care, but he could not guard against the weeds in another man's heart." And with those words, the gentle trap she had laid with the sundial closed, not with force, but with the quiet inevitability of truth revealed. Chapter 9. The Unravelling of Pride. The confession hung in the misty air like the toll of a heavy bell. Mr. Wells, trembling, had dropped all pretense of composure. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of truth, his spectacles slipping down his nose as though even they refused to shield him any longer. The others stood frozen. Lady Beatrice pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips, eyes wide with shock but gleaming with a curious satisfaction, proof that her suspicions of others had not been turned upon her. Colonel Fenton stood stiff and grim, his jaw set, as though bracing against an invisible volley. Poor Clara, pale and shaking, clutched her shawl close, her gaze fixed on the ground, unwilling to look upon the man who had betrayed her guardian's trust. Inspector Graves stepped forward, notebook half raised, but Miss Marple, with her calm authority, lifted a hand ever so gently. Her voice was soft, but it carried more command than any official tone could muster. "Let us be clear, Mr. Wells," she said, her eyes steady upon him. "Your intent was not the rashness of anger, nor the desperation of fear. It was the slow, creeping pride of a man who could not bear to remain in another's shadow. You sought not only Sir Henry's secrets, but his legacy." Mr. Wells's lips quivered. "He mocked me," he muttered bitterly, "dismissed my papers, called my work careless. I gave my years to study, and still he was the one remembered, the one praised. I thought, if his garden, his great puzzle, were to fall silent, then I could step forward and claim what should have been mine." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, her knitting bag resting quietly at her side. "And yet," she said, "it was not ambition alone that betrayed you. It was the little things, as it so often is, the stains of pollen upon your fingers, too fine to come from any harmless bloom. The way your eyes returned again and again to the greenhouse window where the broken vial lay, and when I asked each of you to guide the sundial's shadow, you did not hesitate. You knew too quickly where danger lay. Knowledge may be hidden from some, Mr. Wells, but you revealed yours in eagerness." His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. His hands, once trembling with false innocence, now shook with the release of bitter truth. "I only meant to frighten him," he whispered hoarsely, "to show that he was not invincible in his knowledge. But the powder, it was stronger than I imagined. He stopped, the rest swallowed in the hush of the garden. Clara's soft sob broke the silence. She turned her face into her shawl, as though hiding from both the cruelty of the act and the coldness of the confession. Lady Beatrice muttered something about men and their vanities, though her tone lacked true sympathy. Colonel Fenton exhaled heavily, his arms dropping from their rigid fold at last, as though weary of the entire human folly before him. Miss Marple, however, remained gentle. "Weeds grow swiftly, Mr. Wells," she said, "but so too does truth when given light. You believed knowledge could be stolen, claimed through cunning. But true understanding, like a well-tended garden, is earned with patience, humility, and care." Her words settled over the group with the weight of inevitability. Inspector Graves finally stepped forward to place a firm hand on Mr. Wells's shoulder, but the man scarcely resisted. His pride, once his armour, had unravelled thread by thread until nothing remained but a weary scholar broken by his own envy. The garden, bathed now in pale morning light, stood silent around them, its blossoms glistening with dew. It seemed to listen, to witness, as though Sir Henry's spirit lingered still among the flowers he had so carefully nurtured. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief moment, breathing in the mingled scents of rose, lily, and earth. She had seen it all before, the frailty of human pride, the ruin it brought, the quiet truths revealed by patience. To others this might have been a tale of puzzles and poisons. To her it was simply human nature, unfolding in its familiar sorrowful pattern. Chapter 10. The garden restored. The mist had lifted by mid-morning, and with it, the weight that hung upon the Harmonious Garden seemed slowly to drift away. Inspector Graves, stern yet respectful, led Mr. Wells from the sundial with quiet efficiency. The man offered no resistance, his head bowed, his pride crumbled like dry earth beneath a heavy rain. His steps faded down the gravel path until only the whisper of birdsong and the sigh of leaves remained. The guests, shaken and subdued, gathered once more at the conservatory. Lady Beatrice's sharp tongue had lost its edge, her words hushed and almost uncertain. Colonel Fenton sat rigid, yet his eyes were softened by a grim acknowledgement that not all battles are fought on fields of war. And poor Clara, her cheeks pale from tears, sat by the window where the sunlight fell gently upon her shoulders, as though the day itself sought to comfort her. Miss Marple, ever serene, sipped her tea quietly. She had not sought glory in her observations, nor the admiration of those who now looked upon her with awe. To her, it was simply the natural unfolding of human truth, an old story dressed in new leaves, where envy and ambition had once again taken root in a heart too proud to admit its own weakness. After some time, she rose and walked slowly back into the garden. The sundial stood silent, its symbols gleaming faintly in the morning light. The flowers swayed gently, their petals bright with dew, and the fragrance of roses filled the air. Where tragedy had struck only hours before, a calm beauty now lingered, as though the garden itself sought to heal its wounds. Clara followed quietly, her eyes red but steadier now. She looked to Miss Marple with a mixture of grief and gratitude. "Uncle Henry loved this place," she said softly. "He wanted it to be more than a garden, to be a lesson. I was always afraid of its riddles, but now I see. It was never the flowers I should have feared, only the people who might twist their meaning." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand upon the girl's arm. "You are quite right, my dear. Gardens are like people, capable of both healing and harm, but tended with love, they bring harmony, not sorrow." Together they walked the paths, pausing by the greenhouse where the broken vial had been found. Clara closed the window firmly, a symbolic gesture that seemed to shut away the darker chapter of the garden's story. She smiled faintly, promising aloud that she would continue Sir Henry's work, not as a keeper of secrets, but as a teacher of beauty and knowledge for children, so that they might learn to love nature without fear. By the time the guests departed, the harmonious garden had returned to its gentle rhythm. The fountain whispered, bees hummed among the blossoms, and the sundial's shadow fell across a harmless lily, its meaning now nothing more than the passing of an hour. Miss Marple lingered at the gate before leaving. She glanced once more across the expanse of roses and rare blooms, her eyes soft with reflection. Human nature, she thought, was not so different from this garden. Pride, envy, greed, those were the weeds that threatened harmony. But with patience, with careful tending, the truth always grew, as surely as morning followed night. She stepped into the lane, the quiet village of St. Elmsford stretching before her, and the harmonious garden remained behind, restored not by the solving of its riddles, but by the unmasking of the shadows that had fallen across it. And so, in the calm after sorrow, the garden found its peace again, and Miss Marple, with her gentle wisdom, had once more shown that even the most intricate puzzles yield their secrets to a patient eye and a kind heart.